Oh man. Oh no, this game is so scary, guys. Oh, he's gonna get me for sure. Oh man. Oh, he's gonna get me. He's gonna Oh god. Oh, that was so scary. But was it really? Hello, my well-esteemed guests. My name is Bottles, and welcome to Controller Input, where whoever is hosting that show puts their 2 cents on something that's on their mind that has to do with gaming. And today, I'm talking about indie horror. You better watch out, kiddies, or else that jump scare is gonna jump out and get you. Oh no, warning headphone users, things are about to get spooky! But, is it really? Let's think about the indie horror genre for a little bit. One look at the indie horror genre and you can see how imaginative some people are with the games that they put their heart and souls into. I mean, hey, look at games like Slender, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Amnesia. Even some RPGs can be scary thanks to the minds behind Yume Nikki, Aoni, and Eve. I remember playing Aoni in the living room of my house, and every time the titular blue demon appeared, I would jump and say, "Frick, shit." And, you know, my mom would question me every single time. She's like, what are you doing? What was that? But if you would ask me now, I'd say the indie horror scene is starting to get a little dull. What are you talking about? Indie horror games are so good, you might say. I'd say, yeah, that's true, but there's no originality to the games anymore. Not that I'm saying that an unoriginal concept can't make for a great game. I mean, look at Five Nights with Candies. Based off of Five Nights at Freddy's, Vapor, based off of Slender, and Spooky's House of Jump Scares, which you can't tell me isn't similar to PT in some ways. But the thing is, it's starting to feel like nothing new is being brought onto the indie horror scene lately. Let's take a quick history lesson, shall we? Before 2012, the indie horror scene really wasn't that big. The best titles you had were what some would consider to be the classics now. Games like Yume Nikki, Aoni, Araisu Syndrome, Off, and Amnesia come to mind when I think of pre-2012 indie horror titles, and even LSD Dream Emulator had an indie horror type feel with its shoddy graphics and minimalistic visuals and sound design. With these 4 games, we got our indie horror classics. But starting in 2012, we got even more indie horror classics. 2012 was a great year for indie horror because we ended up getting so many good and recognizable titles. Games like Slender, SCP-137 Containment Breach, Eve, I'm Scared.exe, all released in this same year. Doing research for this video, I was surprised just how many influential indie horror games came out in the year 2012. So many that I know and love. Eve and I'm Scared.exe are both indie titles I love to death, and they're some of my favorite indie horror games to this day due to their creativity, ingenuity, innovation, and overall artistic value. With that being said, these pre-2012 and 2012 games were highly influential. Not only did all of these games come into the mainstream due to the rise of Let's Players like PewDiePie, Markiplier, and Azurite Reaction, but these games were also a very high influence on budding indie game developers from then on. Starting in 2012, we saw a huge increase in indie horror games being created and shown off on platforms like YouTube or Twitch. This was a great thing. It caused a rise in the amount of creative potential the community could have, but where there's popularity, you have... Let's talk about the indie horror scene post-2012. The indie horror genre is going stronger than ever before. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of indie horror games being produced on sites like Indie Database, Game Jolt, or Newgrounds every day. Most of these aspiring game developers that upload to these websites want nothing more than to have their game featured on Let's Play channels such as PewDiePie, Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, or anyone willing to play through their game. What better way to get your game noticed than to take an already established formula and use that in your next game, but add a new twist to that. There's nothing wrong with being inspired by or even ripping off another game, as long as you are careful and original about it, adding your own twist. Do whatever you want, but if there's one thing that was swarming the internet and even Let's Players content during the years of 2012, 2013, and 2014, it was what most have called the Slender clones. Let's think about some of the games that Let's Players have played that year. Vapor, a game where you're being chased by a monster and you gotta find objects. Avian, a game where you're being chased by a monster and you're collecting something. Hide and Seek, a game where you're being chased by a monster and you're collecting things. Ile-de-France, Curse of the Aztecs, Cold Fusion, Illusion, and not to mention all the direct Slender fan games and fan sequels. Slender Sanatorium, Slender Hospice, Slender Elementary, Slender Mansion, Slender Claustrophobia, Slender's Woods, Haunt the Real Slender Game, Slender Carnival, Slender Christmas Special, Slender Prison, Slender Haunt, Slender the Nine Pages, Slender Space, Slender the Remake, Slender Shadows, Night Shadows. How many Slender games do we have to get before it gets old? Personally, I never really enjoyed the Slender games, but even with the people that did enjoy the concept, were seeming to get bored with it. I mean, those were only the most popular Slender fan games there were. There were millions of mediocre and even bad Slender clones. Check out our Let's Play of Shrek Pit 2.exe to see an example. The community was oversaturated with these kinds of games, and on the RPG side, things weren't much better. A lot of those RPGs tried to either be Yume Nikki or Eve, and very few of them were either creative or interesting. The only RPG horrors that come to mind that I really enjoyed were Witch's House and Desert Nightmare. The indie horror genre became stale and unoriginal, and people wanted more. They wanted something original, and something original is what they got. Five Nights at Motherfucking Freddy's! This is the game we needed. This is the game we deserved. This is the game that brought some nice fresh air into the room where it smells like shit and everyone just tries to cover it up with Febreze. Five Nights at Freddy's brought something new and interesting to the horror genre as a whole. They said, you know how in most every game you can walk around or move or literally just have some sort of movement? They said, not anymore. Can't do it. Oh, and there are scary robotic bees coming to you, and you have a non-replenishing way of protecting yourself, so, have fun! That sentence I just said contained the three elements that Five Nights at Freddy's brought to the table that made the gameplay original and interesting. First off, they took away your ability to move. In most indie horror games and even most video games, think of the most fundamental, basic element to controlling your character: movement. Five Nights at Freddy's ripped that away from you and made you sit your ass down and take it. Or did it? You don't take it, you fend for yourself, which brings me to the next element that made this game great. You have to close doors, look at cameras, turn on the lights to see if the spooky scaries are at your door. But there's a catch. Your electrical power, which is drained by everything you do other than just sitting there, is a limited resource. You're limited to how much you can look at the cameras, how long the doors can be closed, and have the lights on so you can see if the spooky scaries are there. And this brings an element of strategy to the game, especially during the later nights. The inclusion of a dominant strategy has been something that was surprisingly absent from indie horror games before it. Think about Slender, or games like Slender. Is there a dominant strategy that the player not only has to figure out, but master? Not really. It all comes down to wandering, getting lucky enough to find a page, and hoping to God that Slender isn't right behind you to tickle your booty. The strategy added an immense amount of fun to the game that casual gamers can get into and hardcore gamers could master. It was very accessible to all kinds of players, and its $5 price tag definitely helped out, allowing this game to scare everybody. This brings me to the third point, that these animatronics are actually legitimately scary. I remember how actually scared I was, not just playing this game, but just watching Markiplier play the game for the first time. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy were legitimately scary when this game came out. I mean, look at them. They're so creepy looking, the lighting is perfect, the modeling is perfect, and their animation during the later nights is horribly disturbing. This is more than I can say for Slender and other Slender games that do nothing to give you atmosphere, except for blinding you and playing an extremely loud scare chord. Five Nights at Freddy's was the freshest breath of fresh air that we could have had at that particular time in the indie game timeline. But then, history repeated itself. Five Nights at Freddy's was the breath of fresh air the indie horror genre needed, but where there is success, there are the rip-offs and fan games. Five Nights at Wario's, Five Nights at Candy's, Those Nights at Rachel's, One Night at Flumpty's, Five Nights at Sonic's, Five Nights in Anime, Five Nights in Bikini Bottom, Five Nights at the Chum Bucket, and the countless fan-made prequels and sequels to the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. We're starting to see a resurgence of unoriginality in the indie horror community once again, except this time they're not Slender clones, even though some of them still are, but there are more and more Five Nights at Freddy's clones. Hell, if you go on GameJolt, they have an entire hashtag dedicated to just FNAF fan games. I'm pretty sure not even Slender had a whole hashtag dedicated to it when those clones were popular. But Bottles, you may be saying, not all of the indie horror games coming out now are Five Nights clones. In fact, a lot of them are having you move around a scary environment as the story unfolds around you. So, history is not repeating itself. Really? It's not? Well, that game you just described sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? A game where the story takes you on a journey, and as you walk through it, the scares and story unfold around you. Kinda sounds like PT, doesn't it? Ah, shit, now we're ripping off the AAA scene too. Games like Layers of Fear, Repeat, The Park, and so many others that repeat the PT formula. Listen, on a very serious note, throughout this video I've been very critical about clones and ripoffs of games like Slender, Eve, Five Nights at Freddy's, and PT. And I want to make this entirely clear before I go on. Just because a game is inspired by, or even blatantly rips off another game, that doesn't mean that it's a horrible game automatically. Hell, some of them are my favorite indie games, like Vapor, One Night at Flumpty's 2, and Layers of Fear. Just because I rag on it for being an unoriginal idea doesn't take away from the quality of the experience that the game brings. I'm just saying that the indie horror genre as a whole, as a result of all of these games being mechanically similar, is starting to get bland once again. If there's one thing I want to promote in the indie gaming community, it's creativity. And there is a lot of creative ideas out there, even with FNAF, Eve, Slender, and PT clones floating around out there. The thing I want to put across to you guys is that I don't want the indie horror game to hit the slump that it hit from 2013 to 2014. I want the indie horror genre, and hell, indie games in general, to flourish like it did back in the beginning of 2012, where original, amazing storytelling techniques were the norm of the genre. I've been in love with the genre since I played Iraisu Syndrome and I'm Scared.exe, and I want to see more creative ideas like those. I'm not a game designer, so I can't offer up any solution, but that's where I leave it to you, the indie game developers out there. Think of something. Shock all Let's Players. Think of new, impossible ways to tell your story, and make it possible. Look at a game like Five Nights at Freddy's, which uses well-hidden Easter eggs to tell its story. Or Undertale, though not a horror game, uses a system that tracks when a player opens and closes the game to hint at a huger story than what's on the screen. Shock the world. Maybe you'll become the next Scott Cawthon. Have a great day, everybody. So since this video took me about 6,000 years to make, something came to my attention that actually is what I've been looking for. A new creative way to tell a story in a horror game has appeared, and that game is Sara is Missing. For those of you in the dark about this game, Sara is Missing is a game where you take control of a person that has found the phone of someone who has gone missing. In using this phone to solve the mystery of what happened, you wander into something bigger than yourself. For the entire game, all you see is the phone screen, and that's it. But in this phone screen, you are told the entire story through usage of texts, photos, and videos. This is a very new and creative way to tell your story, and I can see many people taking inspiration from this game to make their own mysteries. If you'd like to play this game, please, please, please support this game by going to the itch.io page in the description of this video. Right now, it's on a pay-what-you-want basis, and the developer, Monsoon Lab, is trying to get this game on Steam. So help them out and support anything else Monsoon Lab might create. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful night.